my guest this year, and I want to go to my guest. We are joined with the man himself, Dr. Warwick Powell. How you doing, Warwick? You doing okay this morning? Well, this evening for you? For us?
I'm very well. How about yourself?
I am doing okay. I'm developing a sore throat for some reason, and it's happening all at once. But otherwise, I am intact. I am good. Dr. Warwick Powell, he's an adjunct professor at Queensland University, let's go this way. Adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association, Incorporated. Warwick, you are the man I want to talk to today. You wrote a fantastic piece. And I've referenced that piece even in your absence. That's how good that piece was. So it's, let's see, let me point it out. Where is it? It just had the thing up right here. Damn it. Oh, right here. Okay, here we are. I'm sorry. I just had the thing up. So this was a piece that you wrote, and you were given context to what China was effectively doing. China's material squeeze exposes U.S. industrial fragility. Export controls over rare earths and other materials show that reality has the final say. And you made so many good points in this, and some of this stuff I didn't even know myself. One of the things you point out is the new Chinese restrictions announced on October 9th extend beyond commodities to include technological processes required to make them useful. This is a deft and also an important expansion of reach from mere resource controls to technological choke point management. Effectively, these are not just rare earths now. We're talking about the processes that these rare earths are effectively used in. They've expanded the reach and are creating choke points. Am I getting this correct, if I'm understanding this right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in many ways, it's borrowing from the playbook that the United States has used for a long time, which is the ways in which the US has used what people have called the long-arm jurisdiction of trade and related restrictions that condition the ways in which American technologies and products and intellectual property can be used by others. So, so in this regard, this is China's own way of mimicking the common practice that the United States has engaged in for quite a long time.
Tit for tat, effectively. Because it seems like what China is trying to get across is you're dealing with a peer. We don't have to be deferential to you like the Russians. You're dealing with a peer, and you're going to respect us as such. Like this part in, you said, in terms of graphite and materials and lithium batteries, China will now require export permits for synthetic graphite, natural graphite materials used in production of lithium-ion battery anodes. The restriction also covers advanced production processes, including granulation, continuous graphitization, liquid phase coating. These are all technologies that determine battery performance and durability. These technologies are essential for electronic vehicles, consumer electronics, grid scale energy storage systems. China currently accounts for over 90% of the world's graphite anode production and dominates every stage of the lithium battery supply chain. So before we even get to military hardware, this is just basic, everyday living things that this is now going to impact going forward.
Well, it could, and it'll particularly impact the motor vehicles industry, and also it will impact the capacity for at-scale grid batteries to be implemented. We know, for example, that California has successfully been embarking on a program since 2020 of solidifying its grid network with grid-scale batteries, and grid-scale batteries is one of the significant growth areas in the ways in which electricity grids are now being managed. So this really can have a very significant impact on American ambitions in relation to fixing and stabilizing and ultimately improving its electricity supply systems. It will have an impact on the automotive sector that uses these sorts of batteries. Should China choose to, strangle the supply of them. What China's doing, though, with both of these batches of initiatives is introducing some export regulations where China is now saying you need to apply for the materials, and we need to know and ultimately approve of the kinds of things that you're using the materials for. China's made it clear that civilian uses will be business as usual in large respects. It's also mentioned that humanitarian uses of these sorts of technologies and materials will be cleared. China's principal concerns is actually around the direct use in military applications. And also, I think that there is going to be some administrative grey area and negotiations to better understand how China defines and understands the question of dual use technologies.
Interesting, interesting. There was something else that I didn't know that you pointed out in this article, which is it's mind-blowing when you really think about it. According to the Pentagon, over 78% of U.S. military systems rely on materials sourced directly or indirectly from China. Rare earths are used in everything from jet engines, precision-guided munitions, to radar systems, nuclear submarine components. A disruption in the Chinese supply chain would delay weapons production and maintenance schedules. So it's not even just the very act of needing to apply basically disrupts an entire supply chain that is required for the military to maintain, let's say, its warfighting stance, or for that matter, to create new additional weapons or radar systems or any of these things. That is amazing.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Bottom line is that we, I think, learned two things in this process. One is the extent to which the United States has a very wide and very deep soft underbelly, particularly in terms of its military industrial system and its dependencies on others, number one. And as a result of that, and I think evidence of that, not only do we have some hard data from the United States itself in terms of its the extent of its dependency on these sorts of materials, but the way that the US administration and associated hangers-on, politicians and various voices in the media and social media responded in terms of its speed and in terms of its anger and venom. It's quite clear that that this issue has hit an incredibly touchy spot. That's the first thing we learn out of this. The second thing is that it just simply reminds us all that those who control the upstream are typically in a very strong position, especially when they control the vast majority of the upstream around the world, and this is the case in many of these areas.
It sounds like you were making the argument, and because I was reading some of the other posts that you were putting on Substack, that what the U.S. is facing is effectively that it would need to, let's say, sort out all of these issues, meaning any plan on this notion of reshoring jobs or reshoring companies and industries, any idea on AI production, any of these things are effectively stalled as the US sorts this out, whereas China would continue to move forward, meaning this is a strategic advantage. This is almost like a checkmate in the way that this is effectively operated, like in practice. Now, this did not come out the blue in the way that the Trump administration is screaming that this came out the blue. As you pointed out, they were screaming bloody murder. Oh my God, China's attacking the world. China hit us for no reason. Why did China initiate this extension of the rare earth minerals ban?
Look, I think generally speaking, it was catalyzed by actions that the United States took and announced on the 29th of September, which was to extend what they call the 50% rule, which covers companies and subsidiaries and related entities that were going to get caught in a wider sanctioned entities list. Now, that in and of itself is quite a provocative or an aggressive move. But I think the real issue for the China side was that came after some understandings were reached in Madrid between the senior trade negotiators that each side would not do anything additional that would cause any provocations or disrupt the very fragile détente that had been reached. And China saw this as a breach of good faith. And now clearly you don't just imagine this particular set of responses out of the blue. So China is clearly also incredibly well prepared for all sorts of eventualities and was able to respond swiftly after the National Day holidays. And again, I think it sheds light on the fact that compared to 8 years ago when Trump first launched the trade wars, China today is a lot more prepared in terms of how it will deal with the cut and thrust, if you will, of negotiations, which is really just a tactical issue in part, but also it has spent 8 years restructuring its economic systems to be better placed to deal with these sorts of attacks that have come at it over the last 7-8 years. The other sector, by the way, that I didn't directly mention that will be impacted by this will be the manufacturing of microprocessors, which also depend significantly on rare earth inputs. So, so this could lead to some impacts on the manufacturing of microprocessors that are used, for example, not only in military equipment, as you touched on earlier, but also for artificial intelligence data centers. So, so basically, these moves touch on a couple of really important components. One is the foundational infrastructure for artificial intelligence, the foundational infrastructure for energy systems, and of course, those two things coincide. You know, you're not really going to get an AI industry without sorting out energy. But the other interesting thing about all of this is that without being able to sort out energy writ large, it's also going to be a significant choke point for any ambitions to reindustrialize the United States, because modern industry is energy intensive, and it's energy intensive because it uses a lot of computational power. It has automation and robotics. None of that is run with much human labor, but it is run with a lot of electricity. So these potential controls to exports, or at least the implementation of controls, can have some important choking effects on the extent to which America can pursue its ambitions in a timely way.
Then fast forward, you get, and I guess this happened before, tit for tat in regards to the ships, where taxes or fees that are being applied to Chinese ships. This was something that the United States implemented. China turns around and does the exact same thing. And they go further than that. They even go after the name of the company. Where is it? It eludes me, and I don't want to just say it because I'm going to get the name wrong.
Yeah, that's the Korean company.
There it is. Yeah, the Korean Hanawa is what it's called, which means that this is not just going directly after, let's say, specific U.S. ships, but subsidiaries. Like, meaning they've extended this. I think what the public needs to realize, or Americans need to realize, is China obviously thought this through. It sounds like they had a list of, let's say, things that they could effectively do in response to what the U.S. was doing, as almost a plan, as a playbook. Like, they knew that the moment that they implemented the expansion of, I guess you could say, the rare earth minerals, it's not really a ban, more, let's say, export controls associated with rare earth minerals, that the U.S. was going to holler, that Trump was immediately going to scream sanctions or tariffs, and they were prepared for this. I mean, give me a take on that, because I don't see, it doesn't seem like this is a desert.
Look, there's a lot of preparation. There's no doubt that after Trump launched the trade wars in March 2018, when you'll recall he actually said the trade wars are, quote, good and easy to win, unquote, China has had to adapt. And for the first couple of years, I think China, of course, was on the back foot, so to speak, because it was coming off the back of an economic system where the property sector was a significant part, but it wasn't that useful in the context of trade wars and technology restrictions. So I think we've discussed before this massive restructuring of the Chinese economy that then took place from roughly 2018 through till now, which has put China in a much stronger position. But in doing so, it's also done its homework in relation to how it may respond to restrictions and sanctions and tariffs that the United States may throw at it. And we're seeing the consequences of that now. So in material economic terms, it has significantly boosted critical sectors. It has committed significant resources to the development of automated set industries, robotics. It's boosted the capacity, the entire ecosystem for microprocessors itself, which, whilst it hasn't fully caught up with some of the most advanced microprocessors made by folk like NVIDIA, in effect, that China is able to achieve the same kinds of performance outcomes through a combination of smart software, stacking of hardware, as well as the fact that Chinese energy costs are substantially lower. So the cost of the energy cost of a comparable amount of computation in China is lower, which means that they can, in effect, compensate for the fact that their hardware is not quite as good as that the Americans have. So China's prepared quite well now, and it's not to say that China, I think, wants to go down this path. I think China has been very consistent in its view, which is that trade wars don't really have winners. It knocks everybody about, and that there are better ways of addressing and resolving issues than embarking on this sort of stuff. But I think China is much more confident today that it is in a position to not only weather the storm, but to push back very, very firmly and no longer be in a position where it feels it needs to concede ground. So that's where China's at today.
But the US seems immensely ill prepared for this. And what I mean by that is, apparently the Trump administration is coming up with a list of responses. It's like, what do you mean you have to come up with a list of responses? You initiated a trade war. And one of the things that recently took place, apparently the Dutch government stole Chinese company, Nexperia. And in the courtroom documents, it points out that the United States had effectively pushed the pushed the Dutch government to do this. China immediately responds because that company requires products from China. So China bans exports after the Dutch government takes the company. Like, this is amazing. Explain what's going on with this.
Well, I think this is a classic case where the Dutch folded under pressure from the United States. So the company in the Netherlands was acquired by Chinese interests 8.5, 9 years ago. Mm-hmm. At the time, the company was not necessarily in deep financial trouble, but its performance was certainly subpar, and its market positioning was not heading in the right direction. Since the acquisition by Chinese interests, it's been able to streamline its own supply chains, it's been able to get on top of its costs, and has substantially improved its financial performance. So, but the Americans have been pressuring the Dutch that they were going to put this particular company, which supplies semiconductors, into the auto industry and other things in Europe, and also into the US. They're going to put it on a sanctions list. In other words, they were going to, strangle this company unless the Dutch were able to lever out the Chinese shareholder and CEO in particular. And that's exactly what the Dutch ended up doing. And as you mentioned, there was some court documents which now confirm that these actions were taken by the Dutch government as a response to American pressure. The problem for the Dutch is precisely as you've also described, which is that China responded in a way that ultimately significantly cruels the company in question, which undermines any of the reasons that the Dutch, in fact, made a move on the company itself. The other issue, and I think that there's two other issues that really emerge from this. One is, of course, the downstream implications for the clients that this company served, and this is the European automotive sector in particular, who are exposed to risks of supply chain disruptions for important inputs. In other words, this will damage what is already a sector under considerable competitive pressure and industry restructuring pressure. So that's the first thing it does, is that it really shoots European manufacturing in the foot. The second thing it does is that it highlights the risks, the political risks of doing business in Europe at the moment. Not only do you have the Dutch company coming in over the top, but in the last few days, we've also had a former Dutch leader, now the Secretary General of NATO, talk about how China's going to put pressure on Russia to invade Europe so that NATO's busy and China can do what it wants in East Asia. Another Dutch figure, bloviating, this sort of nonsense. And of course, when the Dutch moved on this company, we didn't get one boo out of Brussels, the European Union. And if you are a Chinese company in Europe at the moment, or if you were contemplating going to Europe, because let's not forget the European Union is now talking about seeking to impose technology transfer requirements on Chinese investments in Europe.
Yes, they are.
In this current environment, when the European Union won't even, speak up in defence of a company that's literally been taken over operationally in any regard, it just raises a lot of red flags from a risk point of view. And the flip side risk to the Europeans and to the Brussels is that it makes everybody look at Europe a second time before making serious commitments as far as fixed capital development is concerned.
Yeah, I think we need to nail that down, because the United States is screaming that is theft. The United States was effectively screaming that China stole U.S. technology. Well, what is Europe trying to do at this point? It's trying to effectively say, look, if you have a business there, you need to give us your technology. You need to show us how to do this, which on some level shows the backwardness of Europe, that they would need to do that. There's that. But two, as you point out, A, they've just stolen a company. B, they're in the process of stealing Russian funds. So hundreds of billions of dollars that they're effectively talking about stealing. This seems to create all sorts of liabilities and issues associated with companies coming into Europe.
Just think of it from a risk point of view. Let's say that a new company was thinking of investing in Europe and was actually quite positively disposed to some technology sharing. The problem, on the basis that it was going to have access to a market, that it would be able to generate revenues, sell products, repatriate some profits, etc., etc. So that's the quid pro quo. And these are the sorts of quid pro quos that Western companies engaged in when they first went into China in the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
The risk now is that if you did all of those things, you might still lose the company. So
right, they still steal it.
So you get none of the upside, and at the same time you've given everything away. So it just creates massive risks. And you add this to the sort of talk that you hear coming out of some quarters in Europe concerning all sorts of exotic ways of taking control of Russian frozen assets as a way of delivering something to Ukraine. And again, it's just a red flag. It doesn't matter what you think about the war and what your moral position on that is. If this is the kind of decision that these folks are seriously talking about, it speaks to both a combination of desperation on their part, but also an incredible amount of medium to long-term recklessness, because what they're doing is jeopardizing the long-run attractiveness of their part of the world, their jurisdictions, to foreign investment coming in, creating capabilities, employing locals, training locals, and essentially contributing to the economic development of Europe. They're literally undermining all of that by creating incredible risks for everybody concerned.
One of the things that you pointed out also had to do with the means by which China has, let's say, reshuffled its economy. So Donald Trump eliminated, so right here, imagine president, capitalist country, the uber capitalist country, putting out a tweet like this. I believe China is purposefully not buying our soybeans and causing difficulty for our soybean farmers is an economically hostile act. So China not buying a product is an economically hostile act. We are considering terminating business with China having to do with cooking oil and elements of trade as retribution. As an example, we can easily produce cooking oil ourselves. We don't need to purchase it from China. Now, when Donald Trump said this, immediately within 7 minutes, $450 billion was apparently erased off the market. Look
Yeah,
at that,
well, let's break that up, break that down, right?
please.
The fact that there haven't been any forward orders at all for American soybeans from China this season, in large part, is a result of the fact that American soybeans are more expensive now than they've ever been. And the reason
Mhm.
they're more expensive is because they're subject to a retaliatory tariff that China imposed after Trump imposed his first sets of tariffs. So, the pricing differential that has made American soybeans disadvantageous was caused by the decisions and actions of the Trump administration in the first instance. Point number one. Um, Point number two is that and that there are, of course, point number two is that there are significant alternatives. So if you are going to try to lever something in a particular supply chain, you want to make sure that that there aren't any substantial alternatives around. And Brazil and Argentina, for example, are both substantial alternatives, delivering high quality soybeans at competitive prices. And interestingly, also, their harvest seasons are going to be coming on stream even stronger. And I think most of China's seasonal requirements, as well as any stockpiling that it might contemplate doing, would easily be met. That's not to say that Chinese firms won't begin to buy American soybeans, but it will depend on what the outcomes of any possible meetings are between Presidents Xi and Trump, number one, and how you iron out some of the details, number two. It's actually quite an easy one for the heat to be lowered. I don't think China's got any fundamental objections to buying American soybeans, but they're not going to pay market price plus tariff, and they're not going to remove the tariff unless the Americans did something about tariffs on Chinese goods. So that's one. The other dimension to this is the cooking oil one, right? The cooking oil is actually used cooking oil. It's not clean cooking oil for cooking purposes, and most of the cooking oil that the United States imports, and it's not just from China, it imports plenty of used cooking oil from many other parts of the world, goes into the manufacturing of biofuels in the United States.
I see.
And in theory, of course, the United States could make more biofuels with guess what, with soybeans that it's not selling to the market, but to make more more biofuels from American soybeans, it would need a substantial amount of investment in the production facilities, and it's hard to see anybody doing that. Right? So you can talk a lot about how you can make your own cooking oil or have used cooking oil for biofuels, and again, it goes to all the issues that I raised in some of my more recent essays, and that is that having the intention about something is one thing, but having the material capability to do something about it is an entirely different matter. Building factories, installing equipment, training staff, setting up logistics systems, warehousing, loading docks, et cetera. None of that happens quickly. None of that happens free of charge. And the question that always remains unanswered is who's taking the gamble to fund all of this stuff, especially in light of the fact that the global market is actually ultimately dictating the price of things like soybeans anyway. So these things are far easier said than done.
You hit on something else also. Again, you do fantastic work, Dr. Powell. You pointed out in one of your documents, here it is. You said, here, I'm just sure this is your Substack, just so the audience can see it for themselves. Right here. It says, despite the 27% drop to the United States, Yeah, despite the huge 27% drop to the United States, overall exports was up 8.3% year on year. Now, this is effectively highlights of China export data across different regions and countries year on year from September 2025 back to February 2024. Effectively, what has been the effect of this policy going forward? Just to be clear, explain it for me. You're effectively saying that exports from or to the United States have dropped 24%, but for all intents and purposes, overall exports were up 8.3%, meaning China was able to overcome that loss of 24% from the United States and still make gains in regards to the export market. Am I getting that right?
Yep. So what's happening, and this has been a long-term trend, and what we're seeing is a continuation of this pattern, is that the overall contours of value flows or trade flows in the world have been inexorably shifting away from the United States as a central player. And we see the rate of trade growth in the developing world, the global south, the Belt and Road Initiative related countries, to be far greater than the rate of trade growth overall. And so as these other parts of the world continue to develop, Southeast Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America and the Middle East, and of course Central Asia, the capacity for Chinese exporters to continue finding markets and willing buyers for things that are made in China keeps growing, regardless of what happens in the United States. And these days, the United States or Chinese exports to the United States makes up less than 3% of China's gross domestic product. So less than 3% of China's total annual GDP is attributable to exports to the United States. That's it. And that's likely to continue diminishing as time goes by, in large part because China's GDP continues to grow and grow faster at the rate of trade growth to the US, which of course is not growing at all. And also for the fact that Chinese trade with other parts of the world is also growing faster than the average, and certainly faster than trade growth with the United States is concerned. So as time goes by, the United States actually becomes an even less significant market for Chinese exports than it is today.
You also point out the US is now down to 10.4% of China's overall exports. And I guess that it used to be 6.19% at one point year on year. And imports were also down 11.6%. And this is overall trade is just 8.1% of the global total. Break that down for me.
Yeah, look, basically, I mean, what that tells us is that the US market is relatively less important today than it was. That's the first thing to remember. But secondly, also that trade overall in the world is only a very small part of total economic activity globally, and there is a lot of emphasis made on the quantitative dimensions of trade, particularly in terms of financial balances. But I think that misses two important points. Firstly, that trade is nowhere near as important in the scheme of things compared to other activities. It's not unimportant. Overall, it's $30-odd trillion a year. But relative to the size of economies overall, it's, you know, it has its place, but it's not the dominant driver. And the second thing is that because trade is actually not as significant as many sort of imagine, we then forget that there is a significance in trade, and it's qualitative. In other words, it's not actually about the dollar balances, it's actually about what's being traded and what are the effects of what's being traded. And that takes us back to the discussion around things like rare earths and magnets, et cetera, because those things may not be, in the scheme of things, worth a huge amount in dollar value terms, but they are qualitatively significant because without them, other things can't happen. And so what's more important in terms of thinking about the way trade works, in my view, is to look at the material implications of what it is that's being traded and whether or not trade and the things that are being exchanged enables the participating countries, especially those receiving the goods, to transform their economic systems. So if you are receiving high technology, um, you know, robots or whatever it is, then it doesn't really matter that much that you are spending money and therefore experiencing potentially a financial deficit. What you're doing is enabling your economic system to tap new productive opportunities as a result of the technologies that you've bought. A great example of that is the massive growth in the importation in Africa of Chinese manufactured clean energy technologies, because even though that obviously involves the expenditure of hard currency to pay for these things, the effect of this on the importing countries' economic systems is huge and qualitative and eventually quantitative. It enables them to improve their energy systems. It enables them to become more energy resilient and energy sovereign, delivering the prospects of autonomous economic development on their own terms. So these are the ways in which I think we need to begin to better understand why trade does matter. And we often get a little bit carried away with the financial balances, when more important to understand is actually what the material and what I call the thermodynamic effects actually are.
You're talking about use case or use value as opposed to this financialization. Like this is
Yep.
the whole Russia thing again, right? Where
Yep.
Europe thinks, well, look at how big our economies are. We can obviously take down the Russian government because, you know, we can pass sanctions and Russia's, and they've realized, oh my God, oil is a real thing and you can't eat dollars. Like you can't heat your home with dollars, right? You actually require materials, and those materials have a value to them. That there's a weight to it that is not, that goes beyond just the dollar value of those materials.
Yeah. Look, money is only as good as what you can exchange it for.
Right.
And it's having what you can exchange money for that matters in the end. So it is about use values and the quality of those use values in terms of their ability to contribute to ongoing economic development, and the ability to have low cost, highly efficient energy systems, whether they are from natural gas, from from drilling, which in parts of the world is of course still very abundant, but in other parts not so much. Or, as technologies improve to move down the path of things like solar, wind, batteries, etc. These are critically important things because they enable economies to actually, develop in relatively autonomous ways. If you don't have energy systems that are protected from the interventions of others, you've always got a problem. Europe's seeing this, of course, with its exposures on LNG and oil. So, a great case study is the fact that Africa is rapidly developing its clean, renewable energy capabilities, and the main thing that does is that it enables these countries to be energy autonomous, and that's a better position to be in than energy dependent.
I'm curious on something else. I mean, I looked at this as a change of the world order, whereas under normal circumstances, a hegemon doesn't really care about the thoughts of other countries, if that makes sense. Like, I have an agenda that I want to get accomplished. I don't really care if you care about my of what that agenda is. Meaning, I don't care how you feel about the agenda. I just want you to do what we're telling you to do. And it seems that for the first time, the U.S. has hit its head on two peer competitors, one in a military sense and one in an economic sense. And it doesn't seem to know how to deal with either, meaning the competence of, let's say, the political competence that might have been there in order to kind of deal with these countries seems to be completely absent. And so you have Trump looking for leverage in the military sense or looking for leverage in the economic sense and being on the back foot in both scenarios. This seems new, or correct me if I'm wrong on this.
Look, I think it's absolutely true. And what's interesting is that the United States political establishment, the political elite or the political class, has simply been caught with its pants down on these fronts. And in large part, that's a result of long-standing entitlement and hubris, where it persists in underestimating others and overestimating itself. And consequently, this is where we're at. The United States has did underestimate Russia for a long time. Caricatures like a gas station masquerading as a nation
Yeah.
became dominant tropes in how Russia was conceptualized as another country, and therefore was looked down upon as something that was actually vulnerable, narrowly based, and weak. These caricatures also exist in relation to how the West, and in particular the United States, has understood China. How does it view China, and where does it view China is at? So it talks about China as being a theft of this, and and an imbalanced economy, and too much savings, and not enough consumption, and overcapacity, and a property crisis, and it runs through this series of tropes, and it talks about the unsustainability of something that they think is the Chinese economic model. But all of that serves to largely delude itself, meaning the political class. And I do wonder, why do they do this? Because it certainly doesn't help them, but they stick to it. But perhaps it's mainly there to help them persuade their political base in their own countries that that everything's going to be okay. And look, I kind of get that. The last thing you want to be doing is saying to your own people, actually, we fundamentally miscalculated everything that mattered. And I'm really sorry about this, but your living standards are going to drop 15% as a result of our miscalculations. I can't see any politician doing that, and so they have to sort of conjure up these sorts of explanations. And
Is that
but
number
yeah,
accurate? I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that number accurate? Is it 15% of the living standards that are going to drop as a result of this
well,
nonsense?
it could well be, because we start to look at the sort of cumulative effects, firstly of tariffs, which will flow through. That'll be a couple of percent on inflation in time. But if you end up having a totally isolated America, meaning that the United States, by virtue of its trade policies and other things, is really putting the shutters up, whether
Mhm.
it's with tariffs or some other kind of barrier, then the United States is either going to have less of things. And when you have less of certain things, it's likely that the price of what there is will go up anyway. And of course, it's going to need to try to do things that it hasn't done for a long time, and do them from scratch, and they'll be expensive to do. So in large part, we are going to see in America make an adjustment, as systems invariably do, but in a way that will leave the United States at a higher cost plateau across the board, and with lower standard of living, because of the higher costs and the reduction in availability of goods through supply chains that it no longer accesses.
Do you think what we're looking at is a breaking of the world into two separate parts, kind of like a Cold War? I mean, the fact that a Dutch company is pushed by the U.S. to steal, or the Dutch government is pushed by the U.S. to steal a Chinese company, is pretty mind blowing.
Yeah.
And they did it almost as a vassal will respond, to an emperor giving a decree. And you would think that okay, well, would London do that? Probably, yeah. Would Germany do that? Yeah, if asked. So immediately it creates this kind of difficulty for Chinese and Russian firms, and maybe even other countries, maybe BRICS nations in general, to operate in Europe with any level of confidence and any level of security. It feels like there's a breaking of the
Yeah.
world. I mean, is that what we're looking at?
Look, I think that there is a very significant set of cleavages, and they do run the risk of, in effect, dividing the world into two broad groupings. The way I would think of these two broad groupings is really a colonial grouping, the legacy of the colonial world, and a post-colonial grouping of countries. Now, the issue is going to be, I think, look, I think the data shows that the global south is interacting with each other a lot more than it historically did. China's own development, Russia's development, the establishment and consolidation of BRICS Bank, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO Development Bank, and assorted initiatives, I think has reached a point where the global south, those countries that were the leftover colonies of the Western powers from prior to the First World War or prior to the Second World War, they are going to be able to carry on, so to speak, and pursue their ambitions. I think they do not see what's happening. Well, they're certainly not motivated by the idea that their coordination amongst each other is anti anybody. They view what they're doing as very much about advancing themselves, especially in light of the historical legacy of colonialism, which locked them out of things, which saw a lot of their resources taken away, etc., etc. The interesting question will then come, I think, for Europe, where you do have, I think, another set of divides, right? So the divides that we're starting to see in Europe is between Brussels and the political elite in Brussels and the citizens across the different membership countries. And also, I think, even within member states where, likely to also see further divides, both between the old political establishment and the mass of people who are increasingly disenfranchised and economically disadvantaged, but perhaps even see the emergence of a clearer sense of economic class-based politics again, where many people who have been left behind and left out as a result of 35, 40 years of neoliberalism and all of that brought home to roost on the back of the loss of cheap energy from Russia, etc. Anything can happen in Europe as a result of all of that, when there are a lot of angry and disappointed people. Similarly, the United States, I think, is racked by cleavages as well. And we discussed those, I think, in our last conversation, Jamal, where we looked at the growing gap between the increasingly small proportion of people with an incredible amount of wealth and a growing lower middle class and lower class. Now, at some point, I do wonder again whether these issues will boil over, where the promises of America don't materialize and people end up feeling that that they've been left behind or left out. What happens then? Who knows? But we're not just talking about a world that is divided between the old colonial powers and everyone else, but we're actually talking about a world divided between those owners of capital in large part and their political extensions who've benefited incredibly over 40 years plus of neoliberalism, and everyone else.
I guess the last question, well, I kind of want to. One is Europe screwed? There's that. But I guess the real last question has to do with this conversation that may take place between Trump and Xi Jinping. Donald Trump softened his rhetoric, backed away. Of course, they're talking about taco. Trump always chickens out in the end. And there's an expectation that he's probably going to chicken out on this one also, because he doesn't necessarily have the cards in the way that he could believe that he had the cards. Somebody's probably telling him that. What do you think that conversation is like between these two? And do you think a deal is going to be reached, or what that deal would be if it is reached?
Let's deal with the Europe question quickly first. Europe's going to get poorer unless something fundamentally changes. If Europe gets poorer, then perhaps at some point those who are suffering as a result of increased poverty may end up doing something about it. That's going to take some time to work through the system, but I can't see in the near future, and I'm talking the next 5 to 10 years, Europe fundamentally turning its fortunes around, unless its political leadership can literally overcome some very significant orientation barriers. The first one is the deep-seated Russophobia. If they can't find a way to negotiate a new security settlement with Russia, then they're going to behave the way that they have been over the last while, increasingly panicked, even though at the same time telling the world that NATO and NATO member countries are so much bigger and stronger than Russia. I mean, it's a contradictory message anyway, but there you have it. The second issue that they need to overcome is the legacy of colonialism, which is the idea that somehow, countries of the Orient, whether it's the Near East or the Far East, can somehow have developed and become countries that they might have to learn from and get something from. These are two very important or significant barriers that really, I think, holds at a mental level the European leadership back. So that's Europe. It's going to enter into some increasingly tough times, and there isn't really light at the end of the tunnel for the foreseeable future. As far as the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump goes, assuming that it proceeds on the sidelines of APEC in Korea on the 31st and 31st of this month and 1st of November next month, there's a glass half full way of looking at it and a glass half empty way of looking at this. The glass half full way of looking at this is that there are now a mountain load of different issues that enable the leaders to perhaps trade their way through some of them. You take that one off the table and I'll take this one off the table, and maybe that will whittle down some of the areas of contention. But I don't think that there will be any big deal, because the question of the relationship between China and the United States is not a transactional question. It's a structural question. And it's less a structural questions about China and America. It's actually an American structural problem. The United States has an economic structure which is chronically imbalanced. It's got a social settlement where a growing majority of people are being left out and left behind. And the United States is not a country at peace with itself. The elite is seeking to find ways to blame others for the predicament that the United States is in, and why the promises that the elites have been making to the masses for 2 to 3 generations have simply never materialized. Trickle-down economics has not trickled down one bit, and until the United States addresses the reasons why it deindustrialized, why good working class jobs got destroyed as a result of financialization, until the United States actually recognizes that the explosion of Wall Street over the course of the last 40 years is actually one of the causes of its own deindustrialization, we're going to have domestic contradictions in the United States, which spills over into the international arena. And it spills over because the political leadership is looking to blame someone else. It wants to blame trade for the woes of United States deindustrialization, when trade itself is nothing more than a symptom of deindustrialization. Production location is actually what dictates trade, and you have to make decisions both as a nation and in terms of your systems design, which will affect the location of different kinds of activities. And if you want to have activities located within your jurisdiction, you need to think long and hard about what the conditions you need to create are to make it attractive for those activities to be in your jurisdiction. But don't blame trade. These are things that nation states need to think hard about in terms of what they can do to make production actually something viable, meaningful, and worthwhile to do in their own areas. The United States hasn't even got to that part of the discussion yet. And so until it does, anything that is negotiated will be piecemeal. The best outcome out of all of that, in a sense, is, again, a little bit of a détente, a cooling of hot heads, so that things don't blow up too badly, and people can try to find some normality in the relationship, but in a tenser, less stable, more fragile context. So that's the glass half empty perspective.
Well, yeah, your point is the U.S. is deal averse, that it can't make a real legitimate deal. Is that because, in part, it can't?
Well, what's the deal? What's the deal that it's wanting to make, right? It actually doesn't make things that China really wants. The things that China would happily buy from the United States won't sell to China. that the United States insists on pushing its allies in and around China to buy more arms from the United States and to place missiles within medium-range shooting distance of mainland China. The United States continues to meddle in the affairs of China, and I mean by that the cross-straits issues, and it's highly unlikely to stop doing that in the short term. So what kind of structural rearrangement can we foresee? The United States isn't going to walk away from the idea that it needs to push China back. Now, this is part of current doctrine now. Not only does the United States have a broad view, which is it needs to control the world generally, it actually has a very specific view, which is that it has to commit as much of its resources as it possibly can to contain China in the West Pacific or East Asia, because it has a series of fears. It fears that if it doesn't hold China back, that China will become a regional hegemon, and then from there launch a projection campaign which will put pressure in the United States. That's the domino theory sort of thinking that the United States has. It's probably because that's what the United States did. It dominated the Western Hemisphere and then used that security in its own backyard to project out to the rest of the world. So it fears that. When you read Elbridge Colby's work, he talks about China and Asia in large part because he's fearful that the United States will be cut out of the most economically dynamic part of the world over the next 30 years. He's fearful of that. He thinks that China, should it become a regional hegemon, would and can cut the United States out. So, is the United States going to back out of any of those assessments of the world, which would lead it to, one, accept China as a genuine peer, and two, come to a genuinely meaningful and viable modus vivendi with China, which of course would see the United States leave the East Asian part of the world or West Pacific, and I doubt that it'll do that at the moment. So what are we going to have? A discussion around what? Soybeans, oil, a few tariffs. There will be discussions, of course, around these rare earth export controls, and the discussions are going to revolve around how fast will China administer it, and how is China going to define the question of dual use. Right?
Yeah,
that's a big negotiating space. Right? What constitutes dual use? Well, it's an open question. It really depends on your attitude at the time. And so the United States has got its work cut out because it needs to deal with this stuff now. Otherwise, it's going to have its upstream supply chains on all of these key things for its energy sector, for its automotive sector, for its microprocessing sector curtailed, whilst at the same time, incidentally, other parts of the world can take advantage of this and actually boost their own positions. The European Union, if we go back quickly to them, Jamal, would be well advised to take advantage of this opportunity and move quickly to secure supplies of things like rare earths and the other materials by getting in line first. And I wouldn't be surprised, and I've read some stuff in Global Times, for example, which gives clear indications that that the European customers will be first in line to be cleared through. And so that's where I think things are at.
interesting.
I'm not really quite sure what the US can offer at the moment, because I don't think Donald Trump has a lot of room to move politically. Right.
Dr. Powell, you are fantastic. I swear to God, you are, man. Your explanations are just bar none. Dr. Warwick Powell, he's adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, and also president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association, Incorporated. You have a fantastic rest of your night. Thank you for this.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye. All right. That was a great